Hi everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me here today to speak. So, as Alex sort of pointed out, the main thing that I would like to talk about is the regulatory framework that is aimed to promote investment and competition in fibre deployments in the UK. There's sort of three areas I think I'd like to cover, and I'll logically follow it through this way. So first of all, I'll talk about the regulatory framework that we put in place. So that's our wholesale fixed telecoms market review that we published in March this year. Talk a little bit about that and what's in it. I'd next like to move on and just talk about what's actually happening in the market at the time, the various announcements, where we are on rollout. And then I'm going to move on and actually go into a little bit more speculation about how the market might actually pan out over the next 5 to 8 years, given the announcements and given what's actually been happening at the moment. So the first thing I'll probably start off by saying is, of course, regulation in this market is not new. In fact, it's about 40 years old now, so since BT was privatised back in the early 80s. Since 2003, our regulation has been under the Communications Act. And in fact, we regulated things like local loop unbundling and the ADSL technology, so the early broadband under that regime, and more recently been regulating fibre to the cabinet under that regime. Just for completeness, before that time, regulation was actually done under the Telecoms Act, and that's actually back where we had a licensing regime. But the world moves on, and it always has done in this game. So back in 2015, this is when the sort of investments in FTTC was sort of nearing an end. We decided to conduct a strategic review to really sort of work out where we should be heading next. Now, it's true to say that fibre has always been the end game. It has been for as long as I've been in the industry. But the real question is, when is the timing right, and was the timing right then? So anyway, we undertook this review, 2015-16, and not surprising, the direction was faster broadband, more fibre, but there were technologies being talked about then that could just sort of sweat the copper assets a bit more, so things like G-Fast, but FTTP and full fibre was clearly on the table. So the question for us is, what strategy should we be following, and what's going on? Who are the players in the market? Now, at that time, there was a number of new competitors, and it's good that they are still going strong. I've got Alex sitting over here, who were really pushing the fibre agenda back then. So we had companies like City Fibre that had already been running for several years at that point in time. We had Hyperoptic with their own unique business model. There was GigaClear that had its own unique business model, and there were others as well. So fibre was really being pushed. It's something the government wanted. It's the direction we all wanted to head. So actually, we took the decision that, in fact, we would be pushing for sort of full fibre under our strategy, which was our next sort of big wave of regulation. So this was the beginnings of what became the wholesale fixed telecoms market review, which we published just, as I say, a few months ago. Now, what I would say about that review is that it is different than what we've done in the past, and the changes to some extent are quite subtle, but actually also quite significant, and I'll talk a little bit more of those in a moment. But the one thing I would say about it is regulation doesn't really change overnight and spin on a dime. So although we've just published our final and full position just a few months ago, in truth, since 2016, we've been moving in that direction, and I'll talk about the things that have happened over the last few years which have brought us to where we are today. So, turning to the access review and what's actually in it. So let's just call out some of the features of it and how they are different than what we've done in the past. So the first thing, and it was a heavy document at 1,700 pages, is that we've actually regulated all of the markets that we previously looked at in a single coherent document. So beforehand, we would look at narrowband, we'd look at broadband, we'd look at access, we'd look at calls. And that's really the way the market used to work. But actually, when you start thinking about competition in fibre networks, that just makes no sense. Because on the supply side, you build a fibre network, you're potentially going to supply all services. even on the demand side, differences between things like lease lines and consumer broadband will narrow because the services are becoming that much more capable. So looking at the whole market holistically and ensuring it's coherent across all the services was the logical thing for us to do. And in fact, as I say, we started moving in this direction first back in 2017, where we started to dial back narrow band and remove regulation there. And we also did it in 2018-19, where we started to align the lease lines market, so the business connectivities markets, with this review. So the big thing underpinning our regulatory strategy here is access to BT's ducts and poles. This is because this is a competition model. We are relying and we're trying to generate a competitive dynamic in these rollouts. And of course, rebuilding this infrastructure is very disruptive, very time consuming, very expensive. So using what's already there makes just sense. So that's a big area that we pushed. And interestingly, we first introduced access to BT's ducts and poles back in 2010. There wasn't a lot of interest in it then, but interest has grown through the years. And what we did in 2018-19 was we actually took that market out and we actually did a separate review on physical infrastructure and put that in place back then. So although we've reiterated it now, that was put in place then. So the next part of this is how we went about charge controls. So whilst we are trying to sort of foster competition and get these networks rolled out, it's true that a lot of them don't exist today. But we do have consumers still using the current networks that as a regulator we need to protect. So what we did was we actually put a single price control in on just the 40 meg service as a sort of a protection. This is sort of the safety net product that consumers can still align to. And in doing this, we didn't go for a cost-oriented control. We actually just indexed the current pricing. And what we believed was that pricing would in fact lead to above cost, which would leave margin on the table for investors to actually come in and build the networks. By only focusing on the 40 meg product, it meant that any new or higher speed services that were built off these networks, which of course there will be, are not subject to controls, and any premiums or structures that sit around there is left to the market for the time being. Again, we actually first introduced a 40 meg only regulation back in 2018, early 2018. So again, this is sort of building up over time what we've done here. A real key difference with moving to a fibre network compared to previous regulation is that with previous regulation, the network, so things like ADSL and FTTC, they were overlay networks. The existing copper network didn't need to change. And so we could always focus on that, and you could bolt this on and it could work or it couldn't work, and it sort of didn't matter to some extent. We could still keep that existing network. But with fibre, that's clearly not true. If you're going to upgrade your network to fibre, you're not going to want to keep the copper network running. So a fundamental difference here is built into this regulatory framework is how the copper network can be sensibly switched off with proper sort of transparency and notice periods. Something else that we did put into that is as the copper network is switched off, clearly we would want that 40 meg protection product to be moved onto the fibre network, and we required that, but in doing that we put a fibre premium on it because we think there's more value in the fibre network. An additional charge of up to £1.70 a month can be charged, and that again can go on to help support the investment in the new networks. So the other thing to mention which differs is the framework that we put in place actually legally lasts for 5 years. Previously the frameworks lasted for 3, which probably was a bit too short to be fair, but that was the rules that came to us from Europe. So this now, our regulation sits in place for 5 years, so out to March 2026. But clearly, these networks, they're going to take more than 5 years to build, and the longevity and the payback periods are going to go way beyond that. So we've quite strongly indicated under what conditions we would just roll forward this regulation for at least another 10 years out to 31, which is quite a different thing for us to do. So lastly on the framework, which I think is worth mentioning, is the competition we're seeking to sort of foster, but also how that might vary by geographic location. So this is a competition framework. Clearly, the levels of competition is likely to vary in different parts of the country for all sorts of various reasons. So we set out a structure where we actually geotyped the UK, and we actually did create 3 buckets, although we've only actually used 2 of them. So very briefly, we created what we called Area 1, and the thought process here is there will potentially be areas that will just become competitive and we should stop regulating altogether. That is regulating the services. We would continue to regulate access to ducts and poles because that's our sort of underlining stablemate. Area 2, so this was an area that we sort of felt had prospects for strong material competition over the next few years, and that actually we could go lighter on regulation, and the networks would be built and consumers would be protected by that competitive dynamic. And Area 3, where we was less convinced that there would be a strong competitive pressure. Area 2, just very quickly, was 70% of the country. Area 3, 30%, and Area 1 was currently just a placeholder. Now, of course, we know the level of activity in the market, and we've got a 5-year time period. The idea that we can predict at postcode sector level, which is what we were looking at, exactly how the market is going to turn out in 5 years' time is nonsensical. We could probably get reasonably close, but certainly not precise. And we were very alive to this, and was very alive that if we started having very different regulation in the different areas, that actually that could burn in, if you like, the boundary that we first thought of, and we really didn't want to do that. So we came up with an approach where we wanted to actually have near identical regulation and market conditions both in Area 2 and Area 3, such that any distortions caused by regulation could be minimised. And we did get to that place through a commitment from Openreach to build in parts of Area 3. So we felt that consumers were getting some benefits. And the idea is that anyone now, whether they go into Area 2 or 3, largely see the same conditions. Okay, quickly moving on. So what is happening in the market? So as I mentioned before, interest in building fibre networks has been growing over the last 10 years. Various early adopters, which I've mentioned. But of course, in the last few years, it's really taken off. And BT itself has got more interested, as has Virgin, and the list of companies that have interested has just been getting ever longer, almost by the month over the last year. So I'll quickly call out, what the big announcements are and what's occurring. I'm sure most of you will know this, but so BT's current plans are to build to 25 million, so that's just over 80%, come around 26 time. Pretty much, they're just upgrading their entire network is pretty much their plan. We have Virgin O2, so they're doing their DOCSIS upgrade at the moment, so they will be gigabit capable across their footprint by the end of the year. They're also looking to extend their footprint slightly as well over time. But in the summer this year, they actually announced that they were actually going to do a fibre overlay and largely replace the DOCSIS network with fibre going forward. So that was quite an unexpected and quite a big announcement. We have City Fibre, who have plans to roll out to about 5 to 8 million by about 25, and very pleased to hear the announcement, I think it was just this morning, was it, Alex, that in fact have passed over 1 million properties already, so really going great guns. Hyperoptic, again, plans to roll out to about 5 million come 25. I think the last stats I saw on them, they was at about 0.6 of a million. The list after this gets very long. There is currently about 150 providers that are signed up to use BT's ducts and poles, and each have their own unique business models and plans I'll mention some names, but I really can't. I'm not going to try and read out all 150. But, you know, so people like GigaClear I mentioned earlier, they've been around for a while. We've got Jurassic, been down to see them. They've got an interesting business model. Swish, Community Fibre. Axion announced quite big plans during this year. County Broadband, TrueSpeed, Zoom. There is just loads, and the list was just getting longer and longer, as I say, by the week as we went through this year. So whereabouts are we today in terms of fibre? So fibre at the moment, I mean, it's moving, so any number I give you will probably be wrong, but it's about 27% of the country currently has fibre, or access to fibre. That's about 8 million premises. Of course, gigabit capable is higher than that, and that's because of the DOCSIS upgrades that I just mentioned a moment ago. Now, you know, I understand, and it makes perfect sense, that of all of these small providers, they're building in a way where they're going to try and avoid each other. So they have unique areas. Now, that clearly makes total sense to me. But at the same time, you know, given the plans from BT and Virgin, you know, it is obvious that there is going to be significant overbuild. Now, what I would say to that is that's, from where I sit, that's not really a problem because, of course, our strategy, a key part of it, is investment and competition. So overbuild is something that we are aiming for, but of course we want proper competitive competition on the merits overbuild, not just sort of targeted anti-competitive trying to put people out of business locally, and that is something that we are alive to. So we do want the competition on the merits. So on the subject of competition, this is probably where I should talk about the recent OpenReach FTTP pricing structure, Equinox. So some of you will probably be aware that it was just a few weeks ago, 30th of December, we took our decision on that, and the decision not to block that pricing structure. We are still in an appeal window, so I'll probably try and stick to what's in the statement. But in simple terms, we didn't go to block that because we didn't believe it was anti-competitive. We believed that actually it was just competition on the merits. Sure, it's tougher prices, more aggressive, but not anti-competitive in the sense of an abuse of a position. So that's pretty much where we came out there. So how might the world turn out for us all over the next 5, 6, 7 years? So there are 31 million premises in the UK, and I just mentioned a moment ago that currently about 8 million have been built with fibre. And I talked about some of the plans that are out there. So there's still a lot going on, a lot to play for, and a lot of people in this space. So where might it all end? So in my mind, and I should say that I don't have the perfect crystal ball, I'm just sort of trying to triangulate on the data in front of me. It very much looks like we're heading for a world where there will be some areas where we potentially will have 3 to 4 competing networks. How big those areas, well, we can all guess, but let's sort of say 25-30% of the country, that sort of area. And clearly, it's highly likely that BT, Virgin, and some of you guys, and City Fibre is going to be playing in that space. We're then going to move, and we're going to have areas where there's just 2 competing players, and maybe that would be 40-50% of the country, taking us up to about 75% in total. And who's likely to be there? Well, a lot of it will be BT and Virgin, which is what we've currently got, but also it could well be BT plus another provider as well. And you know, some of the areas being built at the moment would suggest that's where we're going to get to. Then I think we're going to move into an area where there'll be a single player, but it will be commercial build, and maybe 10-15% or so of the country. It would be my guess at this point in time that that's largely going to be BT, but we can discuss that maybe in a moment. And then, of course, we really get to the last 10 or 15% or so, and these are the areas where commercial deployment just isn't viable for anybody, and this is where BD UK comes in, and its £5 billion gigabit project that it's working on. So what notes would I like to finish on? I guess I'd really like to finish on just sort of a view. So with so much interest coming in and being built in the way it is with the networks avoiding each other, you know, it seems highly likely that we're going to end up with quite a lot of companies with relatively small footprints. And, you know, and I think we really need to make sure that any efforts are not lost and we can get the value out of that. Having smallish footprints, you know, can be problematic. So I would think about KCOM and the Hull area. We have a small footprint there of just sub 200,000 premises, and KCOM as the incumbent and indeed the monopolist. But of course, that situation started in history where they were the monopolist and they stayed the monopolist. If you're coming in to compete with an existing player in the market, I think that, you know, you've got to win those retail customers. And so how do you go about that? I mean, obviously you can run your own retail channels and just try and win through time, and perfectly reasonable, and I know a lot of people have done that, but it can be hard. Of course, you can look to sell wholesale, but of course, with a small footprint, selling to some of the big ISPs is quite difficult because they will have costs of connecting, and so there are issues there. There are, of course, the potential to have a common wholesale platform, and I was just talking to the guys out the front there of their work, and that can obviously help. But again, if you are selling to a national ISP, that ISP is going to want a common product set. So the way you build your network and present it has to have quite a lot in common with the other networks in the UK. Ultimately, of course, you know, we could well be, and I think let's say it now, we'll be heading towards some sort of merger and acquisition territory. And again, commonality in how the networks are built will help there, because it will just make integration easier through time. Now, I know this is obvious, and I know everyone's busy building networks, but I think just sort of bearing that in mind about maintaining some sort of commonality so that the networks can actually potentially be used better in the future, it would be a good thing. Because at the end of the day, we don't want to see any networks and efforts that are going to building those networks ultimately going to waste. We want those networks to have a purpose that serves UK consumers going forwards. And I'd like to leave it there, so thank you very much.